My cousin dropped her kids off at my place and demanded I babysit them while she went on a 10-week vacation. When I threatened to report her to the authorities, she arranged for me to be harassed in my own home so she could get them back. Unlike real diamonds, kids raised as golden children never turn out to be as perfect as their parents see them. Growing up, my cousin always got her way. No matter how rude or unreasonable she acted towards me, she got away with it all the time. And that was because she was the golden miracle child. What helped this most likely was that my cousin was extraordinarily pretty. She had long wavy hair and blue eyes. And my aunt spent forever comparing our appearances. I have short hair and brown eyes, and I was never as attractive as my cousin. My aunt loved making remarks comparing us. And after we both became teenagers, she was always telling me to dress like my cousin and asking her to teach me how to do makeup. But my cousin would also mock me and make fun of me if I ever asked for help making myself look better. That's how we grew up to be extremely resentful of each other. I think my cousin just picked up on the worst traits I saw in my aunt, while I rejected them all. I think being praised her whole life by my aunt for simply being beautiful turned her into a selfish person who thinks she can get away with anything because of her looks. The way my aunt compared us and constantly put me down caused me to have a lot of self-esteem issues. As an adult, I am very introverted and reserved, and some people describe me as a pushover. Recently, I've been going to therapy to try to build a stronger sense of self-worth. Even though it's been hard standing up for myself in my relationships, for the first time I feel like the way my family treated me really impacted me as an adult, and it's difficult for me to maintain healthy friendships or romantic relationships. My cousin even kissed my boyfriend in high school, senior year. For no real reason, she didn't even like him and had often said she thought he was unattractive. My parents told me to forgive her when they found out what had happened. My cousin wasn't even reprimanded, and that was when I truly realized how much they favored her over me. The way my dad just stood by and watched my mom emotionally break me down. My entire life made me feel like no man would ever stand up for me or see any value in me, and it's very hard for me to trust and connect when dating. But my entire life hasn't been all bad because of my mom and cousin. Because the one upside of being the ugly cousin growing up meant I had zero social life and spent all my time studying. I ended up graduating high school with a perfect GPA and landed a full scholarship to my top choice university, which was amazing. Because my mom told me the night before I started high school that she would pay for my cousin's college since she was the oldest, but I'd have to go to a community college and pay my way. I remember crying and asking her why she didn't love me like she loved my cousin, and she insisted that she did, but my cousin deserved it more because she was her firstborn. The day I got my scholarship, I was so excited to share the news with my parents. Part of me felt proud to have accomplished something my cousin hadn't. She had spent all her time partying in high school and earned mediocre grades, with no consequences from my parents. She was only going to college because my parents could afford it, and she wasn't even going to a good one because her grades were so poor. The day I rushed home to tell my family about the scholarship, I was so excited to share my good news. But when I got home and told my parents, my dad simply said, "Good job," and my mom barely reacted. I didn't understand why. Why had my mom even had me just to spend my whole life feeling unloved and inferior to my cousin? The day I got my scholarship became one of the worst days of my life, as I cried myself to sleep and accepted that I'd never have a family that truly loved me the way they loved her. That night, I wrote in my journal until dawn, planning out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I was exhausted from being that sad, overlooked girl. So I finally decided to speak up to my dad. One year, he told me he was proud of me, and it was the most heartfelt thing either of my parents had ever said to me. But even as an adult, my mom still treated me like a stranger in her own home. I only saw them a few times a year, and every time, she'd do everything in her power to steer the attention away from me if anyone showed interest. One year, during Thanksgiving dinner, my cousin congratulated me on a recent promotion I had received at my job. It was awkward, but I tried to smile through it. I had a strong suspicion that my parents had asked her to get rid of the child when she first found out she was pregnant, but she kept it and tried making things work with a man she had known for only a few months. They were completely wrong for each other, but somehow they thought having another baby would fix it. I tried not to cry when I saw her online announcement about her second child, knowing it was all a desperate attempt to keep up appearances. She could be so rude and dismissive, and she was always ready to put me down in front of her kids, using awful language even though they were too young to understand. I don't feel bad calling her out for being completely selfish, especially after she dropped her kids at my doorstep one day without warning. I had been relaxing at home that morning after a long work week when the doorbell rang. It was her, and her voice was so cold and threatening. She blackmailed me by saying she would contact my boss and accuse me of not taking my medication, which could cost me my job. My career was everything to me, and I couldn't afford any risk of losing it. So I hung up and tried to figure out my next move. My head was spinning, and I couldn't stop myself from asking, "Can you name a single time my sister has ever helped me or made my life easier?" I finally snapped and told my mom that both of them had treated me like I wasn't even part of the family, that they'd made me feel like a stranger in my own home. I demanded that my mom visit me so, at the very least, I could leave her there while I flew to Europe to take care of my niece, instead of me having to take care of my sister's mess. I knew deep down that my sister would never abandon her lavish vacation, especially not for something like this. I couldn't help but laugh when she said that, thinking she must be joking, but her face was stone cold serious. I was so emotionally drained at that point that I lost it and demanded to know how my mom could just stand by and let my sister treat me this way. I told her she had raised a total failure of a daughter, someone who ran off to be with a wealthy man rather than getting a job to provide for her children. Of course, my mom just tossed all my words back at me, yelling at me to get out of my own house when I threatened to call the police on her. I felt terrible, knowing my niece and nephew could hear us from the other room. But I was beyond caring at that point. It had been such a draining, emotional day. After finally getting my mom out, my nephew peeked his head around the corner and asked if everything was okay. His eyes were wide with fear, and the sadness in them broke my heart. Even though I didn't know them very well, I could feel the weight of the situation, and I wished more than anything they didn't have to experience this. They were just kids, and I knew they didn't deserve to be put through any of this. My sister had always tried to break me down, and at that moment, it was working. We kept going back and forth until she hung up on me, threatening to get me fired. That was when I truly realized how powerless I was against her. And I broke down in tears, feeling like everything was falling apart. My niece and nephew were watching a movie downstairs, so I had some privacy to collect myself. My friend had warned me about how unhinged my sister was, that she wouldn't hesitate to act on her threats. Even though I was overwhelmed, I knew I had to prepare for what was coming. Despite everything, I didn't want my niece and nephew to feel unsafe or unloved. I knew what it was like to grow up feeling neglected, and I wasn't going to let them go through the same. Spending the afternoon with my niece and nephew, I noticed my older nephew's clothes were too small, and both of their socks had holes in them. I checked the rest of the clothes my sister had packed, and they were either too old or too small for the kids. I wasn't shocked, my sister had always been neglectful, but it still stung. I decided to take them to the mall for some new clothes. As we were picking out things, my younger nephew suddenly broke down and hugged me tightly. On the drive home, I noticed him crying again and asked if he was okay. Through his tears, he asked why I was being so nice to them, as if they didn't deserve it. I told him they deserved it because they were my family, and just being kids meant they deserved to be happy. Hearing that made him cry even harder, and he opened up about how angry he was at his mom for everything. I wanted to yell at her, call her every name in the book, but I tried to stay calm and steer the conversation away from the anger. When I brought up CPS, my sister lost it. She shot back with the same threats, claiming I'd lose my job if anyone found out about me not taking my medication. She didn't care if it was true or not. She was willing to lie and destroy me without a second thought. I couldn't believe it when she said that, and I actually laughed at first, thinking she was joking. But her face was completely serious. I had reached my limit and lost it, confronting my mom about how she could allow my cousin to treat me this way. I told her she had raised a total screw-up. A cousin who was running off to be with a wealthy man instead of getting a real job to support her children. Naturally, my mom just threw all my words back at me, yelling at me to get out of my own house when I threatened to call the police. I felt awful, knowing my niece and nephew could hear everything from the other room. But at that point, I was too emotionally drained to care. It had been one of the worst days of my life. Finally, after getting my mom out of my house, my nephew peeked his head out and asked if everything was okay. His eyes were filled with fear, and the sadness in his gaze broke my heart. Even though I didn't know them very well, I could feel how much they were affected by this mess. I wished so badly they didn't have to go through any of it. They were just kids, and they deserved so much more. My cousin had always tried to break me down emotionally, and in that moment, it was working. We kept going back and forth until she hung up on me, threatening to ruin my career. That was when it hit me just how powerless I was against her, and I broke down in tears, realizing how much damage she had caused. My niece and nephew were downstairs, quietly watching a movie, so I finally had some time alone to process everything. A friend of mine had warned me that my cousin was completely unhinged, and would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. Even though I was overwhelmed, I knew I had to stay strong. I didn't want my niece and nephew to feel unloved or unsafe. I remembered how it felt to be neglected as a child, and I wasn't going to let them experience the same. Spending time with my niece and nephew that afternoon, I noticed my older nephew's clothes were too small and that both of them had holes in their socks. I went through the clothes my cousin had packed, and it was clear they were either too old or too small for the kids. I wasn't surprised, my cousin had always been neglectful. Still, I decided to take them to the mall for some new clothes. On the way home, my younger nephew broke down, hugging me tightly. I asked him if he was okay, and through his tears, he asked why I was being so kind to them. He looked so confused. I told him that they were my family, and just being kids meant they deserved happiness. That seemed to make him cry even harder, and he told me he was angry at his mom. My heart broke for him. I wanted to scream at my cousin, call her every name in the book, but I tried to stay calm. When I brought up contacting CPS, my cousin flipped. She lashed out, telling me I'd lose my job if anyone found out about my mental health, and claimed she didn't care if she was lying. She'd do whatever it took to destroy me. Later, I decided to go ahead and contact CPS, knowing I had to protect my niece and nephew. The agent who took my call seemed to understand the situation immediately. He listened to the recordings I had, and after hearing them, he confirmed that my cousin was clearly using blackmail to avoid responsibility and neglecting her children. I knew my mom would likely reach out to my cousin immediately, trying to warn her. Still, I couldn't just sit back and let my cousin continue to harm my niece and nephew. The day I went into work to meet with my supervisors was nerve-wracking, but I knew I had prepared myself as much as possible. My cousin had always been a threat to my career, and I knew she wouldn't hesitate to try and sabotage it. As I sat in the meeting, I was relieved when my supervisors reviewed the medical evidence and accepted it. They even apologized for any stress the meeting caused me, and one of them congratulated me on the excellent work I had done recently. The whole situation left me feeling emotionally exhausted, but at least I knew my career wasn't in jeopardy. When my cousin found out that CPS was involved, she completely lost it again, calling me every name in the book and swearing revenge. She even said she was going to catch the first flight home to make me regret everything. I just laughed at her threats, knowing she could never break me the way she wanted. I realized, though, that she was just like my mom, manipulative and cruel, and that I hated her more than anyone else in the world. That night, I checked on my sleeping nephews. I couldn't sleep myself, as my mind raced with thoughts of what was going to happen next. I quietly cried in the hallway after closing the door to the guest room. My nephews were such innocent little boys, and they didn't deserve any of this. The next day was complete chaos. I was jolted awake by loud knocking on my door. It sounded more like someone slapping a pillow repeatedly. As I groggily walked out of the guest room, I saw them, two strangers in my house. I tried to step in between my nephews and the man, trying to shield them from what was happening, but my cousin barked at the man to put my nephews in the car. Everything unraveled from there. As soon as my nephews realized what was happening, they started begging my cousin to leave them with me. I rushed to pull my oldest nephew from the stranger's arms, but the man shoved me, slamming my head against the wall. I saw stars and collapsed to the floor. They were terrified, just like I had been at their age, but now they were scared and barefoot, being dragged away by some stranger and my unhinged cousin. I felt an overwhelming disgust with my mom. How could she just stand there and watch that man toss me aside in my own home, all while letting my nephews be taken from me without a word? I couldn't believe how cruel my family had become. I kept thinking about my nephews, wondering if they were okay, if they knew that I was trying to protect them. When I finally calmed down and was able to reflect on what had happened, I couldn't shake the image of my mom and cousin. My mom was wearing an outfit that seemed completely out of place, like she wasn't even thinking clearly. I started to think my cousin might have been on something. She looked completely feral, her eyes wild with a frantic energy that made it feel like she wasn't fully present. I wondered if she had been using substances since she had arrived from her overseas trip with her sugar daddy. It was like something in her had completely snapped. She was unrecognizable, completely detached from reality. The more I thought about everything, the more I realized how badly I wanted to get my nephews away from her, away from that whole mess. I could give them everything my cousin couldn't. I thought about what a custody battle might look like. If it came to that, the judge would be looking at one woman who had been running off with a man twice her age, and another who had a stable job, degrees, and a life that was set. But even as I tried to think positively, anxiety kept creeping in, especially as I imagined what would happen if my cousin and that huge man came up against the cops on the side of the highway. I couldn't believe this was happening to me, to my family. It felt surreal, like something out of a reality show. I was still reeling from the shock of everything when the officer who had tried to restrain my cousin shared something else with me. That my cousin actually wanted to speak to me. The thought made my stomach turn. The last thing I wanted was to make a bad impression on his family. I knew I had to stay composed if I was ever going to be involved in their lives. In a desperate attempt to check on my nephews, I called CPS, hoping I could speak with them. But they wouldn't let me. I tried to explain that I was family, one of the few stable family members they had. But they didn't seem to care. This was a different department, and they were relentless. At that moment, I felt completely powerless, emotionally drained, and utterly alone. My dad was nowhere to be found. He had no interest in getting involved. Even though I was sure he knew everything that was going on. He was spineless, just like my useless mom. My mom didn't even care about her own grandchildren. I was sitting at the bar at the airport, 2 cocktails deep, when I started scrolling through some photos of my nephews that I had taken. They were such fun, active kids, always out exploring with me, showing me their favorite nature hikes and the stunning views in their area. At one point, my boyfriend and I went on a hike, just the two of us, to his favorite secret waterfall. We swam in the water, laughed, and kissed for hours. It was one of the most romantic days of my life, and I couldn't believe how perfectly the trip had gone, even though I had been so worried before I left. But despite the beauty of it all, my mind kept drifting back to my nephews. I couldn't shake the worry about their safety. I knew that being with strangers couldn't have been good for them, even if it was better than being with my cousin. I also couldn't stop thinking about how my cousin had dragged them out of my house that morning, without letting them grab any of their belongings. My youngest nephew had this little dog plushie that he carried everywhere, and I'd been sleeping with it ever since my cousin had taken them away. It broke my heart, and I wondered if she tried to get custody back. I called the CPS agent to check on the case, and asked about the possibility of me gaining custody of my nephews. The agent told me it would depend on whether any other relatives showed up in court to ask for custody. I knew right away that I was going to step up and do whatever it took to get them. I opened a custody case, even though I knew it would take time and cost a lot in legal fees. I didn't care. I would get the best lawyer I could afford because I was determined to fight for them. When I mentioned that I had opened the custody case against my cousin for full custody, I saw the shock on her face. I guess her public defender hadn't informed her before then. My cousin was finding out for the first time in court that day. And, as expected, she didn't handle the news well. After the judge let it slip, my cousin completely snapped. Even though we were in the middle of a courtroom, she turned toward me, screamed my name, and accused me of betraying her in front of everyone. I have never felt such sweet satisfaction as I did when my mom took the stand, testifying against my cousin and throwing her under the bus. My mom, who had always been so loyal to my cousin, was now sobbing her usual crocodile tears. It was hard to believe, but she was finally betraying her perfect golden child. It had taken a lifetime for her to do it, and now the government's help was what finally broke her loyalty. I knew that day, looking up at my mom on the stand, that it would be the last time I ever allowed her back into my life. Later, as I was sitting with my nephews, my youngest one, who had been carrying his little plush dog around, suddenly ran into my arms. I wrapped him up in a tight hug, and just as I did, my oldest nephew joined us. Both boys cried into my hair, telling me how much they missed me. My eldest looked up at me, his big eyes full of tears, and just said, "I knew it, Auntie. I just knew you would come back for us one day."